On this Friday night, hiring spree. Canada's job market grows by leaps and bounds.
Still a lot of employers looking to fill positions.
The rise in wages and potential ripple effect on interest rates. A fresh climb in COVID cases. The message from doctors as people gather for Thanksgiving. India's latest move against Canada.
Ottawa really doesn't want this to turn into a major international incident.
How diplomatic tensions are a blow to business. And she's a tireless champion of Indigenous kids.
Children only get one childhood, and so we've got to be there to make sure it's a special one.
The prestigious prize bestowed upon Cindy Blackstock.
Global National with Farah Nasser.
Good evening. The Canadian job market is delivering jobs at a surprising rate, with the latest employment numbers blowing past expectations today. Statistics Canada says the country added some 64,000 jobs in September, more than tripling what many economists had predicted. That growth was largely driven by part-time work, though, which rose by 48,000 positions. Now, despite the surge, Canada's jobless rate held steady at 5.5% for the third consecutive month. Economists warn we shouldn't get too excited about these latest numbers, as another Bank of Canada interest rate decision looms later this month. Nivrita Ganguly has tonight's top story.
It's been a long few months for Purna Iyer as the 26-year-old searches for a job.
I've been looking for a job since summer, so let's say from the month of May up to now. I've been trying to get a full-time job in my industry. But it has been a little difficult and I haven't landed anything so far.
Iyer says it was easier to find jobs earlier this year, and this recruitment expert agrees.
When you go back to the beginning of the year, we came from a market that was overheated. Many organizations out of the pandemic were hiring and even overhiring in some instances.
A slowdown in hiring is necessary, economists say, to rebalance labor markets after record low unemployment rates earlier this year.
When we look at the levels of job postings right now, I'm back to that, where we were in 2019. It's still reflective of a healthy market, still a lot of employers looking to fill positions, and we're seeing that now.
And historic population growth is helping.
Record population growth this year. We're over 3% population growth that we're going to see. And so we're fixing that issue about very tight labor markets and a lot of pressure on the labor market by adding on the supply side.
But for job seekers, that's a challenge.
There are job openings, but there aren't enough job openings for the number of candidates that are now in this country.
Along with the 64,000 jobs added in September, we saw wage growth coming in higher than expected at 5.3%. Now, that figure could cause concerns for the Bank of Canada when it meets later this month to review interest rates, as it can contribute to inflation. And it is businesses that are bearing the brunt of those higher wages, especially as the economy slows.
It's a tough time, and I think it's important for organizations and employees to really navigate this together.
I would say it has been pretty stressful, but I just have to keep at it till I get the job I need and till I hit the mark.
Nivrita Ganguly, Global News, Toronto.
As Canadians prepare for Thanksgiving, many will feel the pain of rising food prices, but it's not the only thing to worry about this long weekend. COVID cases are on the rise, and as we know, holiday gatherings can bring increased risk. Heather Yourex-West on how to keep your loved ones as healthy as possible.
Turkey, stuffing, cranberries and gravy, and people crowded into a small indoor space.
For Thanksgiving dinner or weekend get-togethers, obviously people know what the tools are.
It's the fourth holiday season since the world learned the word COVID-19, and gatherings are once again okay. But across the country, there are also signs that this virus has not disappeared.
While we had very low levels of COVID throughout the summer, Nova Scotia is seeing an increase in COVID activity over the past few weeks.
We're also starting to see other viruses that cause infections. We're seeing a little bit of influenza. We have not seen much RSV yet, but those are the ones we're looking for.
Mandatory mask policies have returned to hospitals and other healthcare settings across Nova Scotia and BC, with select hospitals in Quebec and Ontario requiring their use again as well. The newest COVID boosters will also provide good protection, though in most provinces, both the COVID and annual flu vaccines aren't available until next week.
Look, I'm a healthy person. I tend to take care of my immune system, and I believe this is something I should talk about with my doctor, not media.
Mixed messages, misinformation, and plain old COVID fatigue means vaccine hesitancy is on the rise. And although the National Advisory Committee on Immunization and provincial health officers recommend the COVID boosters as safe and effective, over the last year, uptake has been low.
It's a significant concern. I think recent surveys have suggested that as many as 50% of Canadians are not considering getting vaccinated. As a glass half full sort of person, I would focus on the 50% that want to get their shots and make it as easy as possible.
COVID can still be a brutal and dangerous disease for older adults and anyone who is medically vulnerable, one to be avoided if possible as families gather to share all that pumpkin pie. Heather, Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
Elections Manitoba is apologizing to residents at an Indigenous seniors' home after a nun dressed in religious clothing was assigned to work at a voting booth at the facility.
Was quite shocked to see that she had an Elections Manitoba badge on and here.
And it took all the strength in the world to come in here and vote.
The nun was placed at the Kikanen Center in Winnipeg, home to nearly 60 residents, including dozens of residential school survivors. Elections Manitoba tells Global News they sincerely regret that this occurred and they're holding a meeting with residents so they can do better in the future. The deadline is looming for 41 Canadian diplomats ordered to leave India after that country's government reportedly gave them until October 10th to get out. It's the latest retaliation after Prime Minister Justin Trudeau revealed Canada has credible intelligence linking India to the killing of a Canadian Sikh leader. As Tariya Isri reports, this dramatic reduction in staff only adds another rift in the diplomatic crisis.
At Canada's High Commission in Delhi, the clock is winding down. Most of Canada's diplomats must be gone by Tuesday, as first reported by the Financial Times.
India's latest move definitely escalates the problem, brings it out into the public eye, calls in a way Canada's bluff.
Canada insists it does not want to escalate the situation, but every week there's been an escalation. Travel advisories, suspended visa applications, and now a mass expulsion, with 2/3 of Canada's diplomatic corps ordered out.
Canada has a much larger number of people there, would likely be a reduction in the numbers.
India calls the allegations absurd. It's linked to the killing of Canadian Sikh leader Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Canada maintains the intelligence is credible, but has not publicly revealed its evidence.
I think you'll see a very, very moderate response in the coming weeks from the Canadian side that really looks to preserving our national interests.
National interests like trade. Canada exported more than $10 billion in goods and services to India last year. But trade talks between both countries are now on hold, and travel restrictions are only complicating doing business there.
One of the challenges, of course, is Canadian business leaders that don't have a visa to be able to actually get to India.
Foreign policy experts say there are no signs yet India will retaliate against Canada the way China did back in 2019 by banning canola after the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou. But as the dispute drags on with India, it only complicates Ottawa's plans to reduce its reliance on Beijing. Tariya Isri, Global News, Ottawa.
A 29-year-old woman has been charged with a terrorism offense for her alleged involvement with the so-called Islamic State. The RCMP says Amara Amjad returned to Canada from Syria in early April. She was arrested yesterday in Milton, Ontario, and she was charged with participating in activity of a terrorist group. She's being released on bail, and her next court appearance is scheduled for November 17th. Sweden says it will send Ukraine Gripen fighter jets, but only if it's allowed to join NATO, a bid Turkey and Hungary have delayed. The announcement was made as Russian missiles hit the heart of Kharkiv today in a deadly attack on civilians. Crystal Gamansing reports, and a warning first that some images in this story are very graphic.
A second day of death and destruction. This time, Kharkiv city center was hit. A missile hit my apartment directly. I pulled out my younger son and wife. My mother and older son, the 10-year-old, are still there. The boys are trying to pull him out. First responders found the child. He did not survive. Another family plunged into despair. Another scene of terror refuted by Russia's press secretary. We, as before, reiterate that the Russian military does not strike civilian targets. More than 50 lives were cut short in Horoza following a missile strike Thursday. A UN field team has been dispatched to the area to collect information.
The appalling scenes from the village of Hroza in the Kharkiv region of Ukraine underscore once again the terrible price civilians are paying 20 months after Russia's invasion.
Russia claims it targets military infrastructure, concentrations of troops, and Ukrainian military leadership. But Ukrainians say these were regular apartment buildings with regular people. I'm from the second floor. Everything fell on me from the third. She says rescuers pulled her out of a window using a ladder. The UN says it has verified the injuries of more than 17,000 people, along with more than 9,000 civilian deaths since the start of the full invasion. Although the report released in September notes the numbers are likely considerably higher. Crystal Gamansing, Global News, London.
She stood up to the Iranian government fighting for equality. Coming up, the major victory for Narges Mohammadi and what the Iranian regime is now being urged to do. Imprisoned activist Narges Mohammadi has won this year's Nobel Peace Prize for her fight against the oppression of women in Iran and the promotion of human rights and freedom for all. Her win comes a year after 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died while in the custody of Iran's morality police, sparking unrest right across the country. Neetu Garcha reports.
In an award which pays tribute to the courage of Iranian women, Narges Mohammadi's Nobel Peace Prize is also a big win for the women's movement.
It was a great boost of hope because we need so much of it these days.
The Norwegian Nobel Committee called for the Iranian regime to do the right thing.
Release her so she can be present to receive this honor.
That we have a better human rights situation in Iran.
An engineer by trade and an activist since the 90s, Mohammadi has campaigned for the abolition of the death penalty and has been imprisoned several times. She's currently in the notorious Evin prison, serving multiple sentences on charges including spreading propaganda against the state.
Another sign that Iran's regime is at war with its own people.
This Toronto lawyer hopes the prize will strengthen those who've been pushing politicians and policymakers in Western countries to do more.
It will be very difficult now for Western politicians to go and negotiate with a regime that has a Nobel Peace Prize winner in its prisons.
The threat to women's safety in Iran remains high. Rights groups say one of the most recent examples is a 16-year-old girl, Armita Geravand, who is reportedly in a coma after a confrontation on public transport for not wearing a hijab.
We celebrate this good news with heavy hearts.
In a statement to the New York Times, prepared in advance in the event she won, Mohammadi said she will never stop striving for the realization of democracy, freedom, and equality. Mohammadi's husband watched from their Paris home, saying the prize will embolden the fight for human rights. Her son and daughter, who've campaigned for her freedom, say they're proud. The United Nations says hundreds of people were killed in the Iranian government crackdown during the protests which convulsed the country last year. At least 44 of them were minors. Mohammadi's prize brings another piece of international attention to the ongoing fight for freedom and justice. Neetu Garcha, Global News.
It's often referred to as the Children's Nobel Prize, ahead this special honor for a Canadian Indigenous activist. Millions of children around the world have chosen renowned Canadian Indigenous activist Cindy Blackstock as the winner of the World Children's Prize. Blackstock was presented the award by Queen Sylvia of Sweden. For more than 3 decades, she's fought for the rights of Indigenous children, empowering them to become changemakers. We are now joined by Cindy Blackstock, just back from Sweden in Ottawa. Ms. Blackstock, first of all, congratulations. For those of us who have been following you for years in your work, this is so well deserved. What does this mean to you, this award?
Well, it's an amazing honor because this award is voted on by children around the globe. And as we look at that, we see that these children were learning about First Nations children in Canada and standing in solidarity for them. So it is a credit to the survivors who told their truths, the 60 Scoop survivors who told their truths, because children around the world are now watching over their grandchildren.
Canada has such a dark past when it comes to Indigenous relations, and we just had the most recent Truth and Reconciliation Day. How are the steps we're starting to take on reconciliation being perceived out there in the broader world?
I think people see it in a clear-eyed way, and that is that the history of colonialism is still with us, and that there are challenges right now for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children that ought to be solved because the solutions are on the books, and choices are being made about not acting on those solutions to the detriment of children. So the good thing about Orange Shirt Day is that if the public puts pressure on the government, we've already seen from the past that changes will happen for kids. And when we raise a generation of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children who are healthy and proud, that is going to be one of the greatest legacies for the country and for the globe.
When you were a child, you grew up with a very unique perspective. You had an Indigenous dad and a white mother. And, you know, when you look back at children now and how Indigenous children are treated now as opposed to when you were young, what do you see?
What I see is that the children aren't alone anymore. The First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children aren't alone anymore. We're seeing other children learning about residential schools, learning about colonization, and learning about the wonderful contributions of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in school. And that has prepared this generation to really walk with respect with Indigenous peoples. And I think that that's a real example and should be an inspiration for us to continue. The other thing I'm seeing is that we have got some amazing leaders out there who are saying to the government that we're not going to let you set the timetable for remedying these injustices. If you don't do it voluntarily, then we'll have to take you to court. And that's just simply the way it's going to have to be because children only get one childhood. And so we've got to be there to make sure it's a special one.
I want to get your thoughts on another big development this week, Wab Kinew being chosen as Manitoba's first First Nations Premier. So what went through your mind when you learned he'd been elected?
You know what? It is such a fabulous thing to see so many firsts, like Mary Simon being appointed as Governor General, to see Wab Kinew elected as the first Indigenous Premier. All of these things are really, really sacred. But it only matters if you're first if there's a second and a third. And they have worked so hard, as many of our ancestors did in the past, to cut trail so that people like me could do better and live a better quality of life. And that's what this is all about too, is that all of us, including the children around the globe, are cutting some trail so that we can do better for this generation of children and the ones that follow.
Cindy Blackstock, congratulations again, and thank you so much for your time and your insight as always.
Thanks for having me.
Next, the future of fungi, how wild mushrooms could be key to cleaning up ecosystems. The world of mushrooms has exploded in popularity, and we're talking about much more than what's being cooked up in your kitchen. Our knowledge about the future of fungi is growing, and Sophie Louis got a look at one way mushrooms are now being used to protect and preserve a fish habitat in British Columbia. Sophie.
That's right. There is evidence to show that mushrooms could have the potential to break down toxic oil products. And in northern BC, a conservation group is trying to see if fungi could be the solution to a long-standing problem involving both salmon and railroad ties. We got a rare look at what's happening in a very special area known as the Skeena watershed.
The Skeena is BC's second largest salmon watershed, and it's just over 54,000 square kilometers, which is bigger than Switzerland.
Canadian National Railway runs through this vital fish habitat.
It has all 5 species of wild salmon. We also have the largest strain of wild steelhead in the world.
Its ecosystem is threatened by a chemical found in the rail ties. It's called creosote, a toxic substance that's been used since the 1800s to preserve the wood. When the ties wear out, they're removed from the tracks and piled beside the railway by the thousands, sometimes for decades, where the chemicals can leach into the soil.
They just leave them there. The only time they remove them is either they're going to bring them elsewhere to bury them or burn them. And that just adds to the problem. It doesn't cure the problem.
The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has identified creosote, an oil-based product, as a carcinogen that may pose risks to fish and invertebrates.
I read all these case studies where they used oyster mushrooms to clean up oil or diesel or other fossil fuel spills in the ground. I thought that can't actually work, can it?
The Skeena Coalition set out to investigate, teaming up with local mushroom farmers to test the theory. The victorious mushroom was turkey tail. It munched up the creosote and converted it back to its non-toxic base elements.
We need to do a lot more testing, but what we know at the start is that the worst we can do is we can make these very toxic railway ties significantly less toxic.
An exciting first step. Now the next one is moving from the petri dish to the piles of ties, and that requires the cooperation of CN Railway. McPhail says CN has been contacted, but so far has not agreed to any further development with the remediation project. It's amazing to think the lowly toadstool might be the savior to help keep our planet clean and safe for the future. Farah?
Incredible. Sophie Louis, thank you for that. And you can watch Sophie's full story tomorrow on The New Reality to learn how mushrooms are even being used in music. That's right here on Global. And that's Global National for this Friday night. I'm Farah Nasser. Tonight's Your Canada is Sainte Anne de Bellevue in Quebec. Until tomorrow, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Good night.